Welcome to another episode of Kookievision. In this video, I'm going to be making a first birthday unicorn. Now this design was actually created by Brock of Paper Pixels, and I got it created into a cookie cutter by Sweet Shapes Co. I'll put both their links in the description of this video. And first off, I'm starting out by drawing the design onto the sugar cookie. And to do this, I've actually got my projector casting the image from above, and it's casting the image onto the cookie, and I'm just basically tracing out with a food dye pen here, just kind of giving myself some guidelines of where I want the icing to go. Now I'm going to disregard some of the other details that are just going to get covered, so the eyes and the cheeks. Now you don't need to go too heavy on the lines, they can be nice and light, and you don't have to use black either, you can use anything. I know a lot of people like to use yellow because it's probably one of the lightest colors that you can actually see. That would work too. And if you don't have a projector like I do, you can always use a stencil or try doing it freehand, or you can make your own stencil out of cardstock or paper. Just cut it out and then trace it onto the cookie. Another one of the details that I'm disregarding is the wick and the flame that goes on top of the horn. It's so small that I don't want the marker lines to show through, so I'm not going to bother drawing those. I'm just going to do it freehand later on. If you're not doing this for a first birthday, you could totally just extend that horn all the way up and just disregard the wick and the flame altogether. And now that I've got the design drawn onto the cookie, I can move on to flooding the background layers. So I'm going to start out with the face and all the white details. So this is a white piping consistency royal icing that I have here in a piping bag, and this is fitted with a number 2 tip. And I'm just outlining the face, kind of going around the hair kind of hanging in the face, and I'm going to outline the ears as well. Next, I want to fill in these areas, so I'm using a white flooding consistency royal icing that I have here in a squeeze bottle. Now you can use any regular squeeze bottle. I just so happen to be using a Sweet Sugar Bell squeeze bottle, which happens to have a coupler attachment. I always use a number 3 tip with my flooding consistencies, and I want to make sure to mention this, that you want to make sure that your icing is a bit on the thicker side, so still a flooding consistency but more thicker than usual, just because there's so many tiny areas on this cookie, and small areas like this tend to crater when they dry, which basically means you'll get this divot in the middle of your icing, basically where it sinks. And to not have this problem, you want to make sure that your flooding consistency is a bit on the thicker side. Also, to pop any air bubbles with your scribe tool, that really helps too. And especially you want to make sure that you really build up these areas, so really get a lot of royal icing in there. And the trick to getting a lot of royal icing into a small spot like that is to make sure it's on the thicker side, so keep that in mind. Now this handy little tool is called a dust pump, and I've actually filled it with a hybrid sparkle dust in Super Pearl. This is created by Roxy and Rich. They specialize in 100% edible food colorants. And while the icing was still wet, I spritzed a little bit on there to give it a nice little sparkle. Now I've let this layer dry for about 10 minutes before moving on to the next step. And to create the wick, I just made a tiny little line with a piping consistency white royal icing fitted with a number 1 tip. And to make the flame, I'm doing a teardrop shape And this is a piping consistency pastel yellow royal icing fitted with a number 2 tip. And I'm going to use the same icing to outline one of the hair tufts in the face of the unicorn, and to outline the part of the mane that's coming out the bottom as well. Next, I want to flood in these areas with a flooding consistency royal icing that I have here in the same color, the pastel yellow, in a squeeze bottle. And again, I'm using a Sweet Sugar Bell squeeze bottle, so it does have the coupler attachment. For all of the the flooding consistencies in this video, I am going to be using a number 3 tip on the end of it. Again, make sure that the icing is on the thicker side so you can really overfill those areas without them going over the edge and creating craters as well. And I let that crust over for about 10 minutes. I just want to keep these two areas separate, so the best way to do that is to let the other area dry before you move on to the other so that they don't run into each other. And again, I've just outlined that with the same color that I used for the mane, and the flooding consistency is the same as well. And to neaten up those corners, I'm just using a scribe tool to get all that icing towards the edge, and also using it to pop any air bubbles if needed. And for the next part of the mane, I'm using a greenish blue royal icing. This is actually a bit of mint green that I've mixed with a touch of sky blue. And I didn't use a whole lot of dye because I want all these colors to hold a very pastel kind of color. You can always achieve this also by adding a touch of white food coloring if you have it as well. And I'm outlining the mane area and the part of the mane that comes down towards the bottom and around with a piping consistency of this color, and this is a number 2 tip. And I'm going to fill it in with the same color, this time in a flooding consistency as well. And you can see I'm really loading up these small areas with the royal icing. If your icing was a thinner consistency, you definitely couldn't get away with this without the icing just kind of rolling over the edge. So make sure it's nice and thick and really build up the icing to make it nice and puffy. And like always, make sure you use your scribe tool to get rid of any air bubbles and get all the icing towards the corners. So next I'm working on the pink part of the mane, and you want to make sure that that greenish blue dries at least for 10 to 20 minutes until it's crusted over. Since we're using pastel colors, you don't have to wait too long in between layers when it comes to the problem of color bleeding, because the colors aren't very potent. You shouldn't have any problems with color bleeding in this case. And I've outlined the top part of the mane and the bottom part as well with the pink royal icing. This is a piping consistency fitted with a number 2 tip, and I do believe I used a dusty rose for this color. And I'm going to take the same color here in a squeeze bottle, this time in a flooding consistency. And that tiny little part at the top is super tiny, so make sure you load it up real good with royal icing to make it nice and puffy, and do the bottom part as well. And you'll want to make sure that you let this dry for about 10 to 20 minutes to let it crust over before moving on to the last part of the mane. And I always recommend you put your cookies in front of a fan to dry them. Not only does this help with cratering issues, but it gives your cookie a really nice shine too as well. And the last part I'm working on is the purple part of the mane, and I've used just a touch of purple dye to get this this color, and I do believe I used a tiny bit of white as well, since purple is a pretty potent color. And I just outlined the top part of the mane as well as the bottom part of the mane, and I'm going to fill it in with the same color, this time in a squeeze bottle. And again, that area at the top is super tiny, so make sure you really load it up with royal icing to make sure it stays nice and puffy and crater free. And just work your way along the side of the face and towards the bottom and around with this color. Now to create the horn, I'm using a stiff consistency this time. This is a pastel yellow, and the reason why you want it nice and stiff is because you want it to hold its shape. And I'm basically swirling all the way to the top, tapering off towards the wick. And you can see the nice kind of ridges here, and that's what you want to keep, and that's what the stiff consistency is going to do. And that was a number 1 tip that I used for the horn, and I've let this cookie dry completely overnight. You can let it dry for about 6 to 8 hours. And I'm using a little bit of pink petal dust that I've mixed with a touch of vodka to make it paintable. I'm using just a cotton swab here to kind of just swirl that color onto the cheeks. And you want to make sure that petal dust is nice and diluted by the vodka so it stays nice and pastel pink. And I'm using a little bit of the same color for the ears as well. Now to add a little bit of extra sparkle to the nose and the horn of the unicorn, I'm using a soft gold hybrid luster dust. This is by Roxy and Rich as well. And I've diluted it with a little bit of vodka to make it paintable, and I'm using a nice clean brush to paint it onto the nose and the horn. And you'll see I don't have to do too much to get that nice soft gold color. That's because I did use a very complementing color for the icing underneath. So always keep that in mind when you're using luster dust. Use a similar color underneath so that the luster dust goes a lot longer way. And I've also painted the flame as well. And while this flame is still wet, actually, I'm going to use just a touch of rose gold. Again, this is Roxy and Rich hybrid luster dust that I've mixed with a touch of vodka. And I'm going to use a smaller brush this time to kind of do a little bit of this color at the base of the flame to make it look more like fire. And you can see I'm just using the brush at the base of the flame to kind of feather that color, that rose gold, into the soft gold to give it a nice little transition into the next color. And for the eyelashes, I'm using the fine tip end of a Chef Master food decorating pen. This is black. I did 3 eyelashes for each eye, so that's just above the little rosy cheeks there. And I'm using a piping consistency black royal icing fitted with a number 1 tip for the eyes as well. So to really finish off this cookie, I'm going to re-outline everything. So I'm using a number 1 tip for all of these details, just to keep that in mind. So this is a piping consistency white royal icing for the face that I'm using to outline it, and as well as the top of the nose and the outside of the ears too. And for the mane here, I'm starting out with the purple. So I'm using the same colors that I originally used to outline all of these sections, all of them with a number 1 tip. So I started out at the top and I'm doing the part of the mane that comes out the bottom. And as an extra added little detail, I want to do a nice little swirl in the middle of each section of mane. So I will start out at the top where the hair hangs in the face, and I'll go down along the middle of the section and then just create a nice little swirl at the very bottom. And I'm doing the same exact thing here with the pastel yellow as well. And next I'm working on the pastel pink sections. And then the last sections here is the green and blue, and I'm doing the same exact thing, outlining the top and then outlining the bottom, and then doing that nice little swirl down the middle to really pull it all together. And you can see the finished unicorns here, and these unicorns would be perfect for a first birthday as they were originally made for, and you could always leave that flame off the top if you wanted to just stick to a regular unicorn. So thanks for watching, guys. Be sure to like me on Facebook and on Instagram. Bye!